Hello and welcome back. Today I'm using an oil as an example and doing a watercolour from it. By putting the sand on first, the rocks become more apparent, and this beach has got hard rocks that have remained standing and softer rocks that have gone down to a much lower level, and they seem to be more grey, so I think they're probably slate and that's granite. So the next stage is to put in some of the darker colours at the back and work forwards. So I'm going to mix up a grey green for the hillsides in the background. They're sort of lost in the weather that day, but they need to be defined. So just mixing a blue and a green together, and then I'm just going to add a little bit of indigo just to darken it a fraction. And then because I want it warm and dark, I'm adding some raw sienna. I'll just start at the skyline and work forwards, and then while it's still wet I'll drop some other colours in. I've painted this beach all times of the year. It's always an absolute delight and has starred in several films. I'll give you a link to them. And it's a lovely walk. You can walk from the neck. This is Porthcothan. You can walk from Trianon. There are car parks at either end. So I'm now going to put some more raw sienna, and I'm going to mix it with some burnt sienna. Just make a dark brown, and then tint it with a little bit of French ultramarine just to make it a little bit duller because it's so far away, and just drop it in and let it find its own route down from the top. Just a little bit at a time. Just dab the brush on. I'm using a size 4 brush. I will put a list of the paints and materials I'm using in the description. And then it's far more rocky towards the front, the seaward side. I'm just going to stick a little bit more on the back, just in angle it going down. Now I'm changing to a number 2 brush, and I'm going to go in with a much darker brown. So I'm adding indigo to the colour I've just made up, just a little bit of indigo. If you put the darker colour to the side, and then you can blend it gently to the colour you want. And going down to sea level, where there's a couple of little rocks sticking out, just dropping it in at the sea line, at the tide mark, and it'll find its own way and just make it look an authentic eroded cliff. Then with just the indigo, I'm going to go back and just make sideways marks. And then coming forward, there's lots of rocks in the water, so I'm just going to add a little bit more burnt sienna to that mix because the rocks are more forward, so they need to be slightly warmer, and just put them in the sea. And it's got waves breaking over the left, so I'm going to leave that clear. And then there's more rocks just coming into the sea, but you can only see a tiny bit of them, so the answer is just to make them as dark as possible. And then you can judge what's going on. I'm going to add the first headland coming forward, and that's very jagged. And it's got spray crashing up it, so I'll leave the bottom a bit bare to show that it's white water coming up. I could use a bigger brush for this, but I want to leave the area for the white water, so I'm just going steadily. And that gets even darker towards the bottom because it's in shadow and saturated. So I'm just making up the same mix but just a little bit stronger, coming down but leaving room for the water splashing up. It sort of rebounds off the cliff, and the way that that will look very good is if it's crashing against a much darker surface. So I'm now going down to sea level just to put a few little lines in, leaving room for the water crashing up, and a long rock just showing. Now coming forward again, this rock here has got quite a triangle at the front where the wave is crashing up. So we go round the triangle to start with, and then back towards the beach and take it up. This time I am going to use a bigger brush. Take the waves. There's only that one really big wave actually. Just leave a gap for it so it's rolling along, and the rock goes up. I'm going to drop some more indigo in there to allow for nooks and crannies, and then pick up the brown and take it further to the top. So I'm not adding any more paint at the moment, I'm moving what's already there, and by moving the paint around you can show the shape of the rock and how many cracks and little hollows it's got. Just adding a bit more for the front face now. Now I'm taking the brown paint down. I'm not worried about the gaps there for the moment. I'll just carry on getting the shape right. It's got quite a steep side, and then it goes in and it goes around and joins other rocks. There's sort of a little bowl there. The next area is more grey, so I'm just going to add a little bit of green and Naples yellow to that mix and show that this one is perhaps further away and getting more spray on it so it's less visible. Now, having put that on, I now go in with a smaller brush and a very dark colour and put in the top. It's very jagged. And then I'll come down diagonally the way it's formed. Just drop the paint in. It separates it from the forward rock then. And that makes that one stand out nicely. And the same, the other side of it, I'm just going to add a little bit of Naples yellow to that, just to send it back a little bit. Now, coming across the bay, I've now got stones on the sand that I can put in. So I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna and start with the top of them and work down to the beach. I'm changing colour to something slightly darker. Put in the bottom. And then it goes all the way out. So I'm now going to merge the colours a little bit, just to show that it's not a silhouette, that it's three-dimensional. Now I need to make this rock darker so that you can see the difference. But this almost seems half and half, that the front is silvery and the top is very dark. So I'm going to put the silvery bit in first. It might be that it's just catching the light. It might be that there's water on the rocks at that point. And then moving up to the much darker colour. Following the top of the rock, just to give it a good shape. Where the brush lands first often leaves a stronger mark, so if you want to make a shape, that's the way to do it. And just a tiny bit on the area that's lighter, because I have to do that when it's dry, and just try and get slightly rounder shape. And then there's some more rocks going out on the beach. Because it's against the surf, it's got a darker top, it's got a catch in the light, it's got a silhouette. So I'll put the colour on, and in this case I'm going to go round the silhouette again with a little bit of the indigo, and as it's wet it'll run in. And bring the paint down. Bring it down to a rough edge. I'm just going to take some indigo from the palette. Just drop it on. Because it's darker, it'll help the surf look nice and white. And I've got lighter silvery rocks in the middle, so I'm going to go straight to this big one, which is lighter on the top and the middle than it is on the right hand side. So I'll go in with the dark first, which is in shade. Just try and get a reasonable loose edge. Then go to the brown and pull the paint back in again. Pull it away from the edge. And then I'll get slightly lighter paint and go up the top. And this rock, the weathering goes side to side. So if the weathering goes side to side, the brush goes side to side. So I'm just going to drop a few lines in. And again, go around this bit that's in shade. Add a little bit more indigo to that, or any dark colour you've got. Don't rush to the shops, use what you've got. And if you can't mix any of the colours, you can always ask me. Now it's quite light, so I'm going to change to the raw sienna, and I will perhaps use a little bit of homemade grey, but I'll put the raw sienna on as a start. Now I need to add some dark lines to that, so I'm swapping to a smaller brush and darker paint, just the indigo and brown mix, and carrying on with the sideways lines to show the way that it's eroded. And they get a little bit darker towards the front because it's a silhouette against the sea. So I'm just putting a darker line on there, and then I'll use some homemade grey just to drop in for a bit of variety. And any white areas can be filled later on, but you've got to make a start, and this is particularly rough paper, so it gets darker towards the bottom because it's in shadow. So I'm just giving the paint a bit of a stir, and I'm going to change to the bigger brush. And there's lots of loose rocks that are on the beach, so I'm only going to go down to a certain point, and then I'm going to come back and put the loose rocks in when it's dry. So it's quite in shadow at the bottom, so just adding a little bit more indigo to the mix. So I'm going to dry the brush off and just put a little bit of raw sienna on. But I don't want the paint to bleed everywhere, so just doing it in a controlled manner. Thus, whilst that's drying, I can come back to the rocks that are on the beach. I'm taking half the paint to the next part of the palette and letting it down even more. So I've got two greys. I've got more of a warm one and more of a cool one. This does look like slate. Put sideways marks on the way that it seems to have been eroded, leaving the paper showing. Cleaning the brush off, drying it a bit, and then going back with the darker homemade grey that I made. Just dropping a few little bits in between the wet paint. Doing it in a controlled manner. I don't want the whole lot to bleed into each other. I want some variety. Now I'm just going to get the brush and just lift the odd area, just to give it a lighter pattern. Just pick it up, dry the brush off, put the brush in again, and then when that dries, that should give some variation. And I'll do the same over here, but I'm going to change the mix again. I'm going to add a little bit more blue and just go with the shape of the rock. Leave gaps. Go into the other grey, pop it in. I don't want every rock to look the same. And then just add a little bit of the darker mix with the point of the brush this time. And I want to split that up a little bit more because it's got sand that's been thrown on it and a few little rock pools. So I'm just adding the yellow, which in this case is raw umber. Just dropping it in so it breaks up the surface. And then coming back over here and doing the same. Obviously been a very rough night, and the sand's been chucked onto the rocks. All this is now dried. Take the headland out a little bit, and then on the top there's just indication of certain things that catch the light. Just make it slightly more interesting, and a little bit of grey here, so I'll stick that on. and it's so far away, and given that it's low light levels, that's about it. So the next thing to do is to work on this rock, which is darker one side than the other. So I'm going to go back in with the indigo and burnt sienna mix and just put a second coat on. It's very watery paint, and it'll fill any gaps that were left earlier. When a rock is dark and it's near, you don't want it to look a silhouette. It needs to look three-dimensional. So I'm going to add more burnt sienna and just lip the paint round a little bit more in the shape of the rock as I found it. It really depends where you stand. And then watering the paint down even more, just taking the brush for a walk around the nooks and crannies at the bottom. Almost in layers in certain places, make it a bit darker. And it's very, very dark on the edge where it's against the light. So I'll put that bit in and then get the rock to meet in the middle, and slightly darker at the top, but not all the way. So I use some water just to lose the line from that, filling in the space, filling in any areas of white paint if I can. And then coming down onto the beach, there's more loose rock that's submerged for most of the time. Got some more tucked away down here. I'm just putting them in loosely. There is a gully of sand in between. And these rocks are only visible at low tide, so if you're going sketching, you need to check locally when it's low tide or high tide. There was a wonderful man who made a film about this beach and all the things that get collected here, because the current from the Gulf Stream sends things into the beach to get caught behind these rocks and can't go away again. I'll put a link to that in the description. And then coming back to the other side here, I'm just going to make these rocks and hill cliff tops a little bit warmer because they are nearer, and it just makes the picture slightly more three-dimensional. Just adding some sap green and raw sienna, tiny bit of blue to go with it. I'm just going to put a suggestion of perhaps a little bit of grass there, just at the very top. Now there's a lot more rocks on the beach, so I'm just going to go around and find them. And then I will put the water and the surf in. So now I'll move on to the water, which is a very light warm grey. So I'm using some turquoise and homemade grey, and I'm mixing them together just to make a cool colour. I'm leaving a gap by the far rocks because the surf is coming over and the water goes all the way across to there. It's back again. It's going to make it a little bit stronger, dropping some darker paint in. So I want it to show up against the white surf. And it's only blue at the back. It's such a rough day, windy day, that the rest of it is all lost in the surf line. So it comes up round this rock. There's a hint of a wave, it's just changing shape. And I'll drop some more in at the back, and then I've got to try and make it look like it's lipping up the hillside in the back. So it seems to be almost touching it at that point, and then it gets livelier towards the back. So I'll just do a few upstrokes just to show there's something happening. And I'll make a darker line again at the front where it goes into the surf. And then it changes to a warm grey, so I'm just going to put a little bit of Naples yellow in the sea colour and a little bit of French ultramarine. And then at the front I've got a line of surf and a line of grey, and it goes round in a circle. It's almost like a lazy S going. It must be the way it's bouncing off the rocks. So the easiest way to do it is from where it's curling up on a rock, and put the grey in front of that. There's always something you can use as reference. And this all needs separating, so I'm going to use a rigger, go in with a slightly darker grey, and where the waves are crashing and forming, it's a bit like lace. There's just lots of wild water. So I'm just going to put some marks in, and then I will move them with a clear brush. It's the way that they're going round, coming in. So I'm now going to get a round brush, make sure it's really clean, not too much water on it, just soften some of the marks. Whilst that's drying, I can put the reflection on the wet sand of some of the rocks. I've got a reflection here that's quite brown. I'll drop that in. I'm going round a dog. Going back with a smaller brush with slightly more intense colour, adding some more burnt sienna. And then further back, got a long line. So it's not as straight as you think, which is quite interesting. And I'll drop some of the lighter colour in that, the slightly more greeny. Leave room for the man and his dog. And then coming over, the line tapers. Here I've got a reflection of this rock that follows the shape of it, so I'll put the right hand side in first, and again another one just here. That'll show nicely with some blue water I'm just about to put in. And then tiny reflection through this puddle here, but not much. It's just sort of a jagged line, gets a bit bigger. And to make that match, even though it's more narrow, I'll just drop some dark in again. Now, where the sand meets the first lot of surf, there's a tiny reflection, not much. I'm just going to drop that in, and then I've got to make the sand much darker where it meets the water. So I'm using raw sienna and a little bit of grey, because some of it's got standing water on, so it's a different colour. And I'm going to change to a bigger brush, just use a bit more of the grey. And then it changes to a little bit more browny orange. And then in the far corner it's quite dark again. So we've got lots of different lines there. And then there's a dark line where the wave's breaking. So I'm going to do that in slightly darker grey. Just go along under the wave. And the waves don't always go all the way across the beach. Sometimes they sort of divide up. And then the same grey in front of the rock, coming out, make it a bit more bluey grey, add some French ultramarine, coming out in front of this wave. I'm just going to get the brush, just feather that out a little bit, and then use a tissue, just take it to infinity. And that really makes the white wave stand out now. And there's another wave breaking behind the rock, so I'm just going to put some water in there that's darker, and then the rest is just lost in a complete jumble. So I need to just go along and identify anything that I can, just make it a little bit darker so that the waves coming in look white. then getting water and just losing the edge slightly. Moving on to the standing water on the beach, it reflects the sky colour. Adding a little bit more blue than there really is, just so that it stands out. And it can go over the brown I've put down. Beach puddles, just to add a bit of dirty water to it, just to take the edge off. And then further over, I've got more sand to put in. I didn't necessarily go to the edge of every rock when I was doing it. Having put the reflections on the puddles on the sand, I'm now going round and just tinting some of the actual sand itself and making it slightly darker by adding more raw sienna and a tiny bit of burnt sienna together to make the sand look as though the water just left 5 minutes before and it's still quite dark. And it just helps pull the picture together. When you're picture making, you don't put one tone down and that's it, you don't touch it again. You're constantly adjusting just to make sure that everything's in harmony. The person walking their dog gives the beach scale. So I'll start with the back, make a rectangle for their body, and then there's a hood, and then separating their legs a little bit further out at the back because it's been blown by the wind, and then one arm coming forward, two arms coming forward. The dog leader can't do a lot about, sort of invisible, but I've got the dog, and the dog again is another rectangle and some suggestion of legs and a little bit of a head. But if you've got an arm pointing in the direction of a dog, people will assume that there is a lead there. Now for the head, I've got lots of brown behind, so I use a lighter colour. I use Indian red just because it's different in this case. Obviously, if it's your best friend, you want to put the colour in correctly, but I think on a day like that, you just want somebody. And then I'm just going to put a slight suggestion of a reflection, which there is. So I'll do that in a dark colour, and the reflection, just a few little lines there. And then I'm going to make a suggestion of feet, just with a sideways stroke. Go back to the dog because the paint's sunk in quite a lot. Just put a bit more on there. Now there's lots more rocks down here that I hadn't added because I was sorting out where the water stopped and finished. So I can add some rocks going in the direction that the surf breaking on a daily basis has given them a pattern, that they're sort of eroded at an angle. So I'll drop them in and then drop in some indigo, not too strong, but it just give a darker channel. And then the same at the bottom of this rock here, that it's all eroded in the same direction. So I'll just get some more brown and just slip that in a little bit. And this is all left white because that's where the spray was. And now I just need to make the reflections a tiny bit darker, as this rag paper does soak up the paint quite a lot, so often you need two applications in one space. So I'm going to make up some grey turquoise and just drop it back in a little bit. It's the sky colour that's reflected, but it's affected by the colour of the sand and stone around it. So a little bit of French ultramarine. Just dropped in loosely and it find its own way. And all this adjusting of tone makes the surf brighter. And then there's areas of blue in between the brown here, which I hadn't put in earlier because I didn't want to take up the space that the person the dog was going to use. Put a few little shadows in every now and again, just under the rocks. And some of the rocks at the back here got darker areas, few contours in them. They're not like a jelly bean, they are contoured. Now that the picture's dry, I've just worked my way around and found a few highlights, like there's some white splashing on that rock and a little bit more tone on the tide pool. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that you'll explore wild Cornwall yourself. Thank you for watching.